Okay. I made this lesson today super quick. It's not polished, it's not perfect, but essentially, it explains how we went from last week, how this was sort of the state of the global geopolitical system, right? The balance of power in the world, to this week, where it looks a little bit different. So let's have a look at the difference between the two and sort of how the last 100 years helped get us to this point. It's not going to be perfect, but we'll give it the best shot. Last week, if the world was this square and each circle represented the country's ability to influence other countries, right? If you had a large economy, if you had a large military, you could take your big circle and you sort of bump it up to another circle and you could push it around, you could influence it, right? The US is quite large. China, the EU has several countries within it, and Brexit forced the UK to leave. The highlighted countries have nuclear weapons. Again, not to scale. This is all up for sort of interpretation, the size of each ball, right? So nuclear weapons include Russia, the UK, France, India, Israel, Russia, Pakistan, India, and North Korea. And this is how I sort of envisioned the world last week, right? We had a wonderful global community where resources were being traded and people were being able to move between countries mostly. It was a truly global economy where financial assets, resources, labor, individuals could move freely. And then this week, the world's a little bit different due to the sanctions in Russia and Russian aggression in Ukraine. Uh, the world is sort of isolating Russia away from the rest of the global community. So I wanted to go back in time and look at the age of globalization, the Cold War, World War II, and we'll start with World War One. Right, World War One was kind of the culmination of the age of imperialism, where European countries scattered around the world, taking resources, colonizing countries, and when they got done with that, they started to fight each other. We started an incredible simplification. England, France, Russia, the U.S., Japan, and Serbia. Italy switching sides halfway through the war. That formed the Allied powers, and Bulgaria, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, making up the Central Powers. The Central Powers lose the war. The German Empire collapses. The Ottoman Empire collapses, and new countries are born, including Turkey. The Austro-Hungarian Empire collapses, and new countries are born, including Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, and of course, Austria and Hungary. World War I finishes, the Great Depression occurs, the rise of the Nazi Party, the fall of the Russian Empire, moving into the Soviet Union, and World War II occurs, right? There are fewer sort of countries with sizable influence in the world, so there are fewer sort of bubbles or balls on my table here, right? Again, we have France, the Soviet Union, England, and the USA as the Allied powers, versus the Axis power, Nazi Germany, Japan, fascist Italy, Imperial Japan, and we all know the story. These countries end up losing the war. France and England suffer the most well, I wouldn't say the most, right? But France and England um, lose a lot of their ability to influence economically and militarily. But the two countries that come out of the war with nuclear power right away and still the ability to influence other countries is the US and the Soviet Union. We enter the Cold War. The US quickly creates a military alliance called NATO. Um, Israel and Pakistan in the corner start their conflict. OPEC is formed as a way to influence other countries, and the Soviet Union forms the Warsaw Pact. And the US and the Soviet Union never directly engage. Instead, they engage indirectly in several of these proxy wars. You've got Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Cuba, Greece, and Berlin, right? The Cold War is a devastating period of history where these two great superpowers are fighting in all aspects of social life, economic life, political life. Right. And the Cold War ends in the early 90s, 1991, and we enter this age of globalization where, again, not to scale, but the U.S. becomes the dominant global superpower, right? The winner of the war, and we enter a tremendous period of peace where the U.S. Is able to encourage globalization. We have spreading of resources. We have financially integrated economies. We have the dawn of the internet, right? It's an incredible time for economic growth around the world. And this is sort of how I saw the balance of power. Countries were developing new technologies, were innovating with new technologies, and with new alliances, the size of the ball would grow or shrink. There were regional conflicts, but there was never a major conflict in sort of this age of globalization. We could go on for days about the Iraq War and Afghanistan and other regional conflicts, but there wasn't the global conflicts we saw during World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. And then this week, noticed how the sort of things have changed, right? With the Russia invasion of Ukraine, we have the Western world and others isolating Russia from the financial system. So this is how I sort of see the state of global politics. This is how I see the world now. I don't know. It helps me visualize how things are looking now, and maybe I can make some predictions for the future. Will this line here, will this stay for the long term? Will other countries join Russia on the other side? Will Russia continue to grow in size? Will the sanctions from the Western nations work? Who knows? But we haven't seen sort of this line, right? This divided economy, right? This divided world since sort of the Cold War, and then definitely in World War II and definitely in World War One. So this is sort of a new line in my lifetime. I was born in '98, so just at the end of the Cold War here. And this is how I've spent most of my world, in sort of this sort of world and in this sort of world, where there's a relative balance of power. And yeah, right. Thanks.